Hello, I'm Dan Gruber. I hope to convince some of you to consider using a pair of these hiking poles when you're out on the trail. I'm going to talk about the advantages of using poles, how to use them properly, and if you decide that you'd like to give them a try, what to look for. Let me start with advantages. There are many benefits and advantages of using hiking poles. Probably the most obvious is increased stability. One of the companies that's made these poles for decades uses as its marketing slogan the phrase, 4 legs good, 2 legs bad. Obviously, the point is that when you're using poles, typically you'll have at least one and sometimes 2 additional points of contact with the ground. And you'll obviously have a much wider base for enhanced stability. This is really helpful when you're on a steep or uneven or rocky trail. I am somewhat compromised in my sense of balance, which is a polite way of saying that I'm clumsy, and I can tell you for sure that using these poles keeps me from tripping or falling on virtually every hike I take. So increased stability is a major benefit of using poles. Another thing that the poles enable you to do is engage your upper body in your hike. So instead of all of the stress of hiking being on your legs and your leg joints, by using the poles, you can engage the large muscles of your shoulder, your arms, your entire upper torso. And this does a couple of things. First, it gives you a more complete workout because you're involving more of your total musculature in the hike. Also, by using some of your upper body strength, you're actually relieving stress on your legs and your leg joints. So if you have knees that occasionally are painful or ankles that don't like uneven terrain, you'll find that using poles will make for a considerably more comfortable and less stressful hike. There's even some evidence that using poles enables you to go a little faster on the trail, all other things being equal. That may be because the poles let you use more of your muscles. It may be simply because you're more confident, especially on a rough trail, with the enhanced stability provided by the poles, and therefore you're willing to go a little bit faster than you would otherwise. But the fact is that the poles help performance and reduce, in some cases, pain, soreness, tiredness of your legs. Poles are also excellent pieces of safety equipment, obviously for you, but also for other people on the trail who might have unexpected problems. These can be used as canes, as crutches, in a pinch as splints, and even if you have enough of them as a stretcher, although I hope that we never have to use our poles as a stretcher. They're also extremely convenient ways to carry one of the primary pieces of safety equipment, which is duct tape. All you need to do is take your roll of duct tape and wrap it a few dozen times around your pole, and there you have your duct tape readily available at hand, easy to use. You do carry duct tape, right? Of course you do. There are also more mundane uses for poles that turn out to be very handy. If you're out hiking with family or friends and you want to point things out to them, they're terrific at pointing literally at things, especially down by the trail that otherwise they might overlook. I use my poles quite regularly to pick up trash that's gotten a little further off the trail than I can conveniently reach, for example, or gotten caught in a cactus. I can often spear a piece of trash, a candy wrapper or something, and get it back onto the trail, or pick something off of a tree using both sticks and put it in my pocket and take it out. So there really are a myriad of uses and benefits and advantages to having these poles. So suppose that I've gotten you sufficiently interested that you're willing to give it a try. What's the next step? Rather than going out and buying them, I suggest that you try borrowing a pair from a friend. But experience indicates that how you react to trying out a set of poles for a couple of hours on a typical hike depends very significantly on whether you use the poles correctly. So let me cover some of the basics of how to use these poles. Almost any set of poles that you're likely to borrow and perhaps eventually buy will be adjustable in length. They will have telescoping sections. So an obvious question is, okay, what's the right length to adjust it to? What most people use, what I use, and what the manufacturers of these poles will usually recommend is that you adjust the poles to a length such that when you're holding the handle and the tip of the pole is on the ground, your arm forms a right angle, which really means that your forearm is parallel to the ground. Now, you'll see a couple of variations on that theme, and I'd urge you to try this and other alternatives. One alternative that you'll occasionally see is adjusting the pole to a much longer length, so that when you're holding the handle and the tip is on the ground, your forearm is actually pointing up at the sky rather than being parallel to the ground. The rationale for using the poles at this longer length seems to be that in some sense you're actually hanging from the pole, and therefore it's easier to transfer body weight to the pole or to exert force on the pole because you're pulling down on it. Whereas with the normal length pole, although you can still transfer a great deal of weight and force to it, you're pushing down on it. Now, I don't prefer to use this alternative because I find this to be simply an unwieldy length of pole. It's simply too long. And I don't find it to be convenient or comfortable, but you'll occasionally see people with their poles adjusted much longer than what I've suggested. You should try for yourself. The other alternative that sometimes you'll hear about is to adjust the length of the pole depending on whether you're going uphill or downhill, with the idea being that when you're going uphill, you can adjust the length of the pole to be shorter, and when you're going downhill, you can adjust the length to be longer. The problem with that approach, which sounds good in theory, is that most trails don't go up or down for miles at a time. Instead, as you know, most trails are rolling, even if they're gaining or losing elevation, overall. And I don't want to be adjusting my poles constantly in the course of a hike. I find it perfectly acceptable to leave my poles at this length with my arm at a right angle and my forearm parallel to the ground. If I'm going uphill, I just raise my hands. If I'm going downhill, I just lower my hands. It works fine. The next thing to think about is how you hold the pole. Now, you'd think that would be obvious, right? Because most poles that you'll borrow or buy will have a very nicely designed handle, and it seems obvious that what you're supposed to do is hold on to the handle of the pole. That means that the connection between you and the pole is your grip. Well, let's think about this for a minute. How long do you think you're going to be able to keep a firm grip on your poles? An hour? A couple of hours? Could you go all day holding on to the pole? What about if it's warm out and you begin to perspire, which means that your hand will perspire and the handle of the pole will get wet? How comfortable will that be? The other thing to consider is that if your connection to the pole is your grip, that means that if you lose your grip, you lose your pole. Now, normally that's not a big deal. The pole falls at your feet, and provided you don't trip on it, you can just pick it up. But suppose you're hiking on the side of a mountain. In that case, dropping your pole could mean losing your pole permanently. Never a good thing. In fact, the right way to hold hiking poles is not by holding on to the handle. And the giveaway is this loop of fabric, which you'll see comes with almost any decent set of hiking poles. There'll be a wide, flexible loop of fabric up near the top of the handle, and that loop will have a tail on it, whose purpose, after you've read the instructions, is to help you adjust the size of the loop. And the purpose of this loop is to be the connection between you and the pole. And the right way to use the loop is when it's extended out from the handle to put your hand through the loop up from the bottom through the loop, and then to let your hand fall naturally onto the handle. Now, this accomplishes a whole set of things. First, now that your hand is through the loop, that means that if you let go of the handle altogether, you don't lose the pole. It's still connected via the loop. Second, it means you no longer have to grip the handle. Instead, your fingers just lie on the handle very loosely. The primary reason for grasping the handle at all is to swing the pole, not to hang on to it. And finally, if you transfer weight to the pole or exert force downward, that force is being transmitted from your body to the pole through a nice wide strip of fabric that goes across the entire back of your hand and around the sides. It really spreads the force over a wide area to the point where you won't even feel it. It's much more comfortable than trying to exert the same amount of force through your grip alone. Now, often people use these loops improperly. They know they're supposed to use the loop, they just don't do it right, and it's pretty easy to see why. When you pick up the pole, typically the loop is hanging downward from the top of the handle, and so for many people the natural thing to do is to reach through the loop this way to the handle. But if you think about it, what you've actually done is come into the loop from the top and gone top down instead of bottom up. And look at the difference. When I do it the correct way, bottom up, my hand naturally falls onto the handle. When I do it incorrectly, top down, you can see that my hand is resting much lower on the handle. It's not well positioned at all. The other problem with doing it wrong is that whereas doing it right spreads weight and force over a large area on the back of your hand, doing it wrong puts all the force on the edge of your hand in one much smaller spot. This will callus and may even blister if you do it for very long. So remember, the right way to use the handle is bottom up and through, and then just let your hand rest lightly on the handle of the pole. Another thing that people sometimes ask, which seems a little odd, is how do I swing the poles? I mean, it's odd because after all, when we're walking down the trail without poles, we don't think about how to swing our arms. We just let them swing. But if you're not used to carrying something in your hands, it becomes a question. There are two typical patterns that you'll see and experience in the poles swinging. The first is what I call the cross-country skiers pattern, which is where you put both poles out in front of you, dig them in, walk through them, lift, put both poles out, and do it again. Imagine if you were on skis in the snow, it would be like putting out your ski poles and then using them to actually pull yourself forward. The other approach is probably the more common and natural one, which is simply to let your arms swing alternately as they would without poles, and carry the poles along with them. So it's an alternate placement of the poles. I can tell you that after you've used the poles for an hour or two, you will completely forget about whether and how you place the poles. You won't pay any attention at all to which of the patterns you're using or why. I find that I alternate and switch back and forth between those two patterns a dozen times in the course of a hike, usually without any particular reason to do it. I don't worry about it, I don't think about it, it just comes naturally, and it will for you as well. I do find that there are a couple of situations in which I tend to use one pattern or the other. When I'm climbing up a steep trail, and particularly one that's uneven or rocky, so that it's almost like climbing up a series of steps, I often find that I actually will plant both of my poles ahead of me on the trail. And I think the reason that I do that without thinking is that it allows me to exert force through both of my arms, both of my shoulders, and really help myself get up the next step, so to speak, on the trail. So I'm really using it as leverage to raise my body on a steep trail. The other occasion is when I'm going down a steep trail, especially one where it's loose and slippery, like it's got a lot of gravel on it, or it's rocky and uneven. And in that circumstance, I find that I often use the alternate approach. And the reason for that, I believe, is that when you alternate placement of your poles, it means that you almost always have at least one pole tip dug into the ground ahead of you. That allows you to use your pole to steady yourself if you feel your legs slipping out from under you, or to slow yourself down if gravity is pulling you a little bit faster down that trail than you feel comfortable going. So I often find that I'm using the alternate pattern when I'm going down a trail like that. But when I'm on a typical stretch of trail that's fairly level, rolling, not too rocky or uneven, I'll simply switch between the two for no apparent rhyme or reason and not think about it at all, and that's really the key. The last thing I want to cover in talking about how to use poles properly is safety. Virtually any pole that you'll borrow or buy will have a nice sharp metal tip, typically steel or some alloy of steel. And it's sharp and strong, and you want that to be able to dig into the ground and really steady you, support you, keep you from sliding down a trail. When you don't feel the need to use your poles for an extended period of time, obviously the right thing to do is to collapse them, put them into or on your pack, but do so with the point down. You really don't want to have two sharp points sticking up in the air behind you. Often we go just a few steps without using our poles. Maybe the trail narrows down or it gets brushy. I typically will just hold my poles out in front of me like this for a few steps and then start using them again. Or if I want to have my hands completely free for a longer period of time, I may take my hands out of the loop and I'll do something like this. Put the poles under my arm and then my hand is free if I need to, for example, make a phone call. The key, though, in all of these cases is to keep those sharp points down and in front of you so that you know where they are when you're not actively using your poles. Every once in a while, virtually all of us who use poles will take a few steps down the trail like this. And the problem with doing this, as I'm sure you can see, is that I now have two 3-foot-long metal-tipped spears sticking out behind me, and I have turned into a hazard for anyone who's on the trail behind me. So please don't do that. Carry them, put them under your arm. You can even drag them behind you because your hands are through the loop so you won't lose the pole, but always make sure you know where those points are, ideally in front of you and down. Okay. Now, I'm hopeful that some of you will try borrowing a set of poles and using them for a few hours, that you'll use them properly, and you'll find that they really do have some benefits, particularly on tricky trails. So suppose that you've now decided that you're willing to invest in actually getting a set for yourself. Where to go and what should you get? Well, I suggest first going to REI, at least to learn, to see what's available, to talk to knowledgeable people. It's easy to get overwhelmed at REI, even if you're simply focusing on poles, because they probably have 20 different kinds at prices ranging from $100 up to close to $300. But there are alternatives. First, you can buy an acceptable set of hiking poles at Walmart or Target or Big 5 Sporting Goods, probably for no more than $50. Now, to some extent, you do get what you pay for, and what you're liable to get in the way of a new pole that's inexpensive won't be quite as robust and may not have all of the features that a more expensive pole has. But as long as you look for some key characteristics, perfectly acceptable starter poles. The other thing to consider, and what I have done buying many sets of poles over the last 10 or 12 years, is do some research, figure out what features you want, perhaps identify companies, manufacturers that make good poles. You might even find a model specifically that has exactly what you want. Then look for that used on eBay or Craigslist. As long as you're buying something that you can see and inspect, even if it's through good photographs, that hasn't been abused from a seller with a good reputation, you'll find that you can get very good quality poles for much less than half of the retail price. And that's in fact how I've gotten 4 sets of hiking poles in the last 10 or 12 years, and they've all worked out just fine. So what specifically should you look for? Well, as we've discussed, any decent pole will have first a metal tip, steel or an alloy of steel. Sometimes they're described as carbide tips. The pole should telescope, should have telescoping sections so that you can adjust the length. Will have a handle, and of course needs to have this crucial loop up at the handle. Now, you will have a choice of material. Most poles are made out of aluminum, and that's just fine. More expensive poles will be made out of carbon fiber, which is lighter and stronger, but more expensive than aluminum. And cheap poles, I mean cheap, not inexpensive, cheap poles sometimes are made of fiberglass. I urge you to avoid buying fiberglass poles. Fiberglass simply isn't very strong, and the last thing you want is for a pole to break just when you need it the most, as in breaking a fall that you're about to take. Now, you'll have a couple of choices to make in addition to material. The most obvious one is the mechanism by which the pole adjusts in length. These use a cam mechanism where you open or close a cam, open to adjust length, close to lock in place. The nice thing about these cam mechanisms is that they can be adjusted by turning a screw. And turning the screw makes the cam either harder or easier to open and close. And when you have the cams adjusted so that they're a little brake hard to open, a little hard to close, you know that they're getting a very solid lock on the telescoping section. And of course, that's what you want. The last thing you want to have happen, other than the pole breaking, is when you suddenly put full weight on it to break yourself as you begin to fall perhaps, you don't want the pole collapsing, because that won't do you any good at all. Now, there is another length adjustment mechanism that actually has been around for a very long time, because poles originally all came with this screw adjustment mechanism where you twist to unlock the sections and adjust them, and then twist in the other direction to lock the sections back together and keep firmly in place. There's nothing wrong with this approach at all. It's less bulky, it's simpler, it's a little less expensive than the cam lock. But if you're concerned about the strength of your grip or about your strength generally, I suggest you consider cam lock poles, because here the strength of that bond between the sections, the thing that will keep the pole from collapsing, depends directly on the strength of your grip and your ability to tighten them up very firmly. So if you have any concerns about that, then go to the cam lock, even though it's a bit more expensive. The last thing that you'll often have choices about is the handle material. Almost always the handles are made of something hard, black rubber. They may have a texture to give them a nicer feel. They may be covered with suede. They can be made out of cork that's been shellacked to make it hard. But remember that if you use the loop properly, bottom up, then you really don't have to grip the handle at all. Instead, your hand only rests lightly on the handle, and it's really the strap that's doing the work. So what the handle is made of hardly matters. Get whatever you want based on availability, cost, aesthetics. It doesn't matter as long as it has a handle, and particularly has a strap attached to the handle. Okay, so now we've covered the benefits and advantages of using poles, how to use the poles properly, where to get some, and what to look for if you do decide to buy. I hope that after going through this and thinking about it, at least some of you will be willing to give these a try and start using them when you're on the trail. I'm quite confident that if more of us were using hiking poles, we would have a lot fewer trips and falls and cuts and bruises and accident reports to file. So I hope you'll join me in being a hiker with poles out on the trail. Thanks very much.